Hello and welcome. To kick off our Meet the Expert session, please welcome Google Cloud Chief Technologist for Australia and New Zealand, Matthew Zwolenski.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is awesome to be with you both in the room and virtually. We are streaming this online. So welcome to Google and thank you for joining us tonight. I'll host the session with Kelsey, who I'll introduce in a moment. The purpose of this session is really, we're hoping to inspire you, to send you on a journey, to think about new topics, new things to learn, to motivate you to take on new challenges within the technology industry. Before we begin though, in the spirit of reconciliation, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to them and their elders past, present and emerging. Now we're also streaming this across Australia and New Zealand. So in recognising this as a binational event, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua and Treaty of Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So as we begin, for those in the room, emergency procedures. In the unlikely event of an emergency, there'll be safety wardens giving instructions. Bathrooms and accessibility, tucked behind the lifts on the left and right-hand side. Men's is on the left, women's on the right, and there's a unisex accessibility bathroom near the door to the men's. Now your phones, normally we'd say switch them off, but we'd love you to interact, tweet things, just set them to silent. And we'll get more to how to do that in a moment. For those in the room, there's a QR code in front of you, so we're going to use that. And for those online, you'll be able to ask questions of Kelsey. So today we're going to go through some questions that I've got for Kelsey. We'll get to know him a little bit, understand him as a person and some of the things he's been doing. But we do want to take your questions as well. So even those in the room, use the app or the mobile site, because we want to make this even for people that are in the room and those that are virtual today to equally ask questions. And you'll be able to see those online. So start thinking now. And Kelsey can talk about an amazing range of things. I've seen all week talking about DevOps and Agile and technology strategy through to just thinking about careers and topics on mental health and many other things. So go for the range, but we want him leaving saying, wow, those Aussies and Kiwis asked me that one question that really made me think, all right? So he's been called one of the most respected people in cloud today in the world. He's been a huge contributor to the open source community. He's helped pioneer Kubernetes and is a founder of KubeCon. He believes in investing in ourselves, practicing gratitude, simplifying the complex things that we do, and solving problems that benefit everyone. So with that in mind, let's find out what's dope and what's extra dope. Please welcome to the stage our principal developer, Kelsey Hightower. Hang on. Hold on. He's travelled 31.5 hours to see you all. We can give him, please, a huge welcome to the stage. That's it. Thank you. So welcome, Kelsey. How's the trip down under been so far?
Oh, it's dope. I think all the people we meet, it's so funny, this island, it's a big-ass island, but this island, people are so humble because there's this perception that everything is happening on the outside. And so when we meet with customers and we jump on the whiteboard, there's this assumption that everyone is so far behind, even though you essentially live in the future according to the time zones. And that humble nature, though, that I came to really respect, that quote that was on the board, we're humans before we're engineers, that really shines through when people present their solutions. Here's what we got working. And then they kind of do this thing like shy as if it isn't sufficient. But believe it or not, a lot of people are actually doing some really advanced things that I actually learned from. And when people say, well, how do the products actually get any good? It's because of the feedback loop that real people give us. This doesn't work in production. It would be much better if it worked this way. And every time, this is my third trip. This is a long flight. But every time the team asks me to come out, I say, please pack my schedule. 12, 14-hour days, that's how I know it's worth it. So I really love coming here, and so that's how it's been, live way up to expectations.
And a fun fact, Kelsey was our last guest here just before COVID, and our first guest just coming out, so welcome back, and thank you for just being here and taking the time.
Yeah, and just for the record, I didn't start COVID.
But you're ending it.
I'm ending it.
All right. Now, before we get into the tech, we want to ask some rapid-fire questions just to get to know you a little bit more as a person. So outside of work, what do you enjoy doing?
I'm 41 years old now, and I realized that I spent a big chunk of my life trying to acquire a skill set to allow me to be accepted in this technology space. I don't know if you all remember when you got your first set of skills, but I didn't go to college, and I remember looking at my first job, thing that you're going to apply for. They had all these skills that were required. In order to get that job, you almost have to pass that checklist of things. And so I spent most of my life getting to the point where I could actually gain enough respect where I can actually land those jobs. But then I also realized that I didn't put as much time learning how to live. Most people spend a lot of time learning how to work and be the best employee and get that promotion. But then you don't really get that great at life. So it's funny enough, I play things like Magic the Gathering, I'm just chilling. I'm actually a shark. I go to one of those card shops, kind of dressed with my little hip hop gear. Like, do you even know how to play? I said, I think a little bit. And then I do a little move and say, so do I win now? And they're like, oh, this dude really took us for a ride. And so I really am now way more patient. The things I love doing now are things that involve people. I went to Denmark a couple of years ago, and I'm probably going to get the word wrong, but it's like Haggy, or this idea of happiness is embedded in the culture by default. And then I kind of went on this mission to learn how to live and be as good at that as I have been at working.
Awesome. All right, what's something you've broken?
Man, so I broke a lot of things. I'm going to tell a story, and I won't even mention the customer. We had a customer in production running GKE, Google Kubernetes Engine, and I actually gave him some advice I probably shouldn't have gave, and his whole cluster went down, and I didn't realize that this is a production cluster, and it's down, and there's real customers on it, and he texted me, he's like, hey man, that was production. And I didn't even ask, I thought it was like his laptop or Minikube or a dev environment. He was literally taking my word off the cuff for production and taking the advice live. And it totally brought it all the way down. So I asked him not to tell anyone, he didn't. But that was probably the worst thing I've ever broken.
It's probably a good disclaimer to start today's session for anyone takes advice from that.
Yeah. You should take it with a grain of salt.
Try
Trust,
and test.
But verify.
All right, who have you learned the most from?
I would always say like all the famous people that you get to encounter. And I remember I gave this keynote one time, and I realized that was like the first time I told my mom I loved her through the camera. She was watching this live stream, and a lot of people said, where does your work ethic come from? Where does your ambition come from? And we tell ourselves these stories that they come from the people we saw in the movies, these characters acting. And I realized that a lot of my passion for what I do comes from my mom. 8 years old, you're in the house, single mom at the time, and she was a seamstress, working, whatever hours they give you for whatever they pay you. And one day she applied for a job with the US Customs, the Department of Treasury, but one of the requirements is that you actually have to be able to type. And so as she's filling out the application, they say, hey, how many words do you type per minute? And she's guessing, I don't know, 60 sounds good. She can't type at all. And I remember she was playing me back the more details of the story, and she told me she went to the local library and checked out how to type book and a typewriter. You can go to YMCA or library, you actually check out the whole kit to improve yourself. So my mom goes home, and as a kid, you actually don't really know what's going on. You don't have this kind of perspective. And so you hear the pecking. And eventually you hear it. Someone's getting really good at this. And when your mom works any hours that they give you, you always have a random babysitter that can cover the shift because you don't want to miss work opportunities. Then eventually mom comes home with the badge. She has normal work hours. She can predict spending time on the weekend. And then I realized that she willed herself into the future she wanted to see. And she did it by teaching herself, no excuses. You got 2 kids. You got all these things that you should be doing instead. Making sure we ate, making sure we went to sleep, making sure we got to school on time, and then found the opportunity to learn how to touch type. And she told me that when she went to go take that exam, you have to prove that you know how to touch type. And she said, as a kid, I sat down. She said, just please be quiet for 30 minutes. No Game Boy, no books, no toys. And she said, I actually sat there and was super patient. And she did her thing and came out and got the job. And I realized that every job I've ever had in my life, from McDonald's to the job I have here at Google, I take it super seriously. And I've always reminded myself that my skill set, that's on me. And by far, she's the biggest inspiration I've ever had in my life about how to carve out the future you want to see.
Cool. All right, last personal question. What, if anything, is too serious to joke about?
I would probably say like mental health. You know, a lot of people talk about health. We got all these exercise programs. You got the watch on your thing. You try to close the rings, and we take that stuff super serious. You know why? Because that kind of feeds our ego. We get to flex in front of people, like literally flex. You see people at the beach like, why are you flexing? Like, where's your family? Go spend time with them. And then you got this mental health thing, and people don't really take care of that like they would take care of their car or their clothes or their external physical physique. But it's actually the thing that can stress you out when everything else is going well. And since we don't respect that kind of thing, you get people who troll people on things like social media, and they have no idea that you're actually talking to a real human being. And imagine a person that gets that hateful thing, and they have no one to turn to for support. They close the app, and it's just them and their mind. And if that's unstable, that's not a game to be played with. So I think a lot of people underestimate what it is to be an actual person. And so people make a joke about, you're crazy. That's literally a condition that most people never want to be in. And so sometimes I think we forget that we actually have the power to make people feel good. I was watching on the flight over, I saw a documentary called Mr. Rogers, or it's about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he was so adamant about teaching kids. He wanted to combat the cartoons. Cartoons, you blow up things, you get killed, and then somehow you come back to life, all to do it again the next day. And he said this phrase that I thought was amazing. He said, there are people in your life that literally smiled you into smiling. That's how much power you have as an individual. You can walk past someone having a bad day and smile, and they just might smile back. So that's something I don't play with, and I take it serious, and I actually see it as something very fortunate that you can actually change someone's life on the fly. Super simple. So that's one of the things I don't think we should play with. We should embrace and respect as a powerful topic.
I heard a podcast you did recently with somebody who was very public about their mental health, and if you haven't heard it, you can check it out. But you did a really good job of kind of exploring what's behind that and how do you help the individual.
Yeah, and that was interesting. It was Software Daily, and people was exhibiting bad behavior for years, and all of us ignored it. Because it's hard to tell on social media today. Are you just trolling or you have a problem? And I remember him calling me and say, like, he lost his sponsors. He's not sure if he'll ever be respected in the industry again after doing this podcast almost 15 years. And now he's feeling alone. And I asked, like, you've interviewed thousands of guests. And he said he had no friends. Imagine that. You interview 1,000 people, you speak for an hour or two about a range of topics, and you feel like you don't know anyone. And so that really helped me kind of put into context what it's like when people are going through that, and also finding the courage for myself to explore that everybody's on that brink if you're not careful. And so yeah, if you want to hear more about that topic, this is Software Daily. I believe it's called Software Daily, and it's a podcast dedicated to mental health. And I asked them, if he could find the courage to explain what was going on, maybe people will find the ability to forgive him.
Awesome. All right, let's talk a little bit about technology. So I've been hosting Kelsey all week at customers and events like this, and I think I've observed, and you've talked a bit about your career, you've had this knack of finding the thing that's coming. Even, you were into Kubernetes before it was the platform. And so I'm interested, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds, what is on your mind of what's next? What's the technology thing that you're excited about and you'd say, hey, look at this. If you're thinking about 2 or 3 years from now, what does that look like?
I think if you spend time and you study the fundamentals, like when I was getting into Linux, I would go read all the Unix blogs from like the 60s, 70s, the ways they were thinking about computation. And they were describing how things should work, and if computers got fast enough, this is how they would work. And so all the shortcomings they spent their time working on, and then those things became the fundamentals. And if you think about it, Linux hasn't changed dramatically in 30 years. We make system calls, still 30 years later. And so when people ask, how do you pay attention to what's coming? Number one, just pay attention. And there's this saying that says, it's easy to predict the future when you're working on it. So anything that sucks right now, the people working to make it better are literally creating the future. That's how it works. Typically, whatever the problems are in the present tend to be the reason why people build the things that end up looking like the future. So when Kubernetes came out, I had literally every IT job there is. And I remember all of the scripts, you know those scripts that you write, like you log into the deploy server, if you've never been a system administrator, you log into the server and there's like this script called deploy the app.sh. That's the shell script. And then a new person gets hired and it's like, oh, why do you do it this way? And they write a new shell script called deploy the app much, much, much better this time, .sh. And then you get a various collection of timestamps about how to do it. And the next time you have to deploy the app, you log in and you just see like 50 ways of deploying this app. And it's like, why doesn't anyone delete the old ones? It's like, I don't know, man. We use this one for that app. We use this one for that app. And we just don't know which one is safe to delete. And we spent all this time trying to invent this perfect system to take all of this complexity and literally give it an API so we can tell the machines what to do. And so my whole career I have been trying to automate these things. And I realized that, I remember, I think it was Ors, you know, one of the key members of Google Cloud and Technical Infrastructure. He had this paper, I believe, was called The Data Center is the Computer. And that's when it really clicked for me, is that most of these pizza boxes, individual systems, when you put a common API on them, the goal is to take a bunch of systems and make them look like a single system. And if you do that, everything above gets super easy, and you put the complexity behind the scenes. So when Kubernetes came out, and I finally got it to work, I remember writing probably the first user guide on how to actually use it. And I ran a command, and I deleted a server, and the thing came back. I was like, this is it. And so it's only the reason why I was able to recognize that it was going to be the future, because I understood the past that came before.
And you, I mean, on that Kubernetes journey, you invested so much of your time and your career. Was there a point where you said, hang on, maybe this isn't going to be the thing?
I think you realize that it doesn't matter if it's the thing or not. And actually, Kubernetes was the first time that I realized you could make it the thing. There are some people wait for it to become the thing. Oh, that's a little too early. I'll wait till everybody else is using it first, then I'll jump in. And so when Kubernetes was early, it didn't have a, I mean, it was so many features that were missing. We had a 100-node limit. You know how many people were laughing at the Kubernetes community? 100 nodes? This is Google? You should be ashamed. 100 nodes? Mesos is doing 10,000. Y'all should just quit now. Docker was easier to use. People were just confused. We're literally wasting our time. But I remember I would still, when I was presenting Kubernetes at the time, I remember playing Tetris to explain to people what bin packing was like, and then switching to Kubernetes. And I remember the first demo I did, I just ran the kubectl git deployments, and I put the little watch command in front of it. So it's in this loop. And I described the app and a deploy. And I asked the audience, what server is it running on? And they were like, I don't know. I was like, look at that. Every other system we use, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, you have to tell it what server to run on. And then when the server crashes, you got to go jump in. And so it didn't matter to me whether people thought it was going to be the future or not. It was the thing that I wanted to see. And then guess what? All the things that were missing, I found myself contributing. I think we should have one of those. I think that should be there. And you just get into the zone of solving problems. And then one day you look up, you're on stage at this conference you helped create, and there's a bunch of people, and you ask, who's running Kubernetes in production? And they all raise their hand. And you're like, wow, what an irresponsible group of people. This thing is still alpha. And now you look at it, there's thousands and tens of thousands of people all around the world, and we have this common language the way we describe and talk about systems. And so for me, it's like, I found it's just much easier to kind of bet on yourself, especially if you're willing to chip in and then just focus on that. And if it doesn't work out, what I figured was I learned a lot about distributed systems. I learned how to actually implement something like the RAF protocol. Worst come to worst, I just had a bunch of new skills and I could apply for a job at Google one day.
Awesome. Cool. I'm interested in what you've found this week. So this week's been a little bit like, hundreds of customers. It's kind of their annual doctor checkup. Dr. Kelsey, I've got this problem. Can you help me? So you would have, through that, seen probably some common threads or something. You're going, you know what? Here's the fundamentals of how people should be thinking. What are you walking away with, and what's the advice based on everything you've learned this week on the market here?
It's funny, when companies invite you in, they have this perception that you're more knowledgeable than the people they already have. It's such a shame. Maybe you have been that person, so I go on stage and I say something super obvious, and the leadership team is like, this is profound. There's a person in the back is like, I literally said that yesterday. Kelsey is really on to something. And so I think people forget that, you know how companies say, we like to hire the best people? What the hell are you doing with them? You're not listening to them, obviously. And so you get all these good people, and then you put them in these little boxes, system administrator 2, DevOps engineer 1, and then they become invisible to you. And then you say, we need more people. It's like, you keep hiring people, you don't listen to them. So that's one. People forget they probably already have the talent, and they've been suppressing it, and their job should be to go find it. Wow, you keep stepping up. I'll be your umbrella. If you fail, I got you. They forget to do that. The second theme is, and I hear this a lot, especially from big enterprises, that thing isn't enterprise ready. Like, what does that even mean? Most people didn't even build the systems they have, right? They work at this company that's been around for 50 years. Someone else created that spreadsheet where they keep all the firewall rules, and they just keep maintaining it, and they expect every other system in the world to be compatible with that. And the only phrase they can utter is, it isn't enterprise ready. And really what it boils down to is most people will ask, can you make the new thing work the old way? And that's what they want most vendors to do, and that just slows down progress across the board. And so that's the thing where I think people should challenge themselves. What question are you actually asking? Make sure you actually understand it. And the biggest one was personal responsibility. You get in a room, and someone says, our InfoSec team won't allow us to do anything. And you say, well, what did you do to help? And then they're just stunned. Didn't know I was supposed to do anything. I thought complaining was good enough. And so you put it back on them. If you don't understand how hard it is to be in InfoSec, think about it. You got to go to your executive leadership team and say, are we safe? You know what you have to do next. You have to lie and say yes. You don't know if they're actually safe. Think about it. Most developers, there's some developers in the room. There's some developers on the live stream. You go to GitHub and you're like, ooh, it has more than 200 stars. This is obviously a really good TLS implementation. Import, security, pass all data through this open source library maintained by this person that's 8 years old that learned Python 3 years ago. This is the maintainer of the security library that your entire enterprise depends on. You never met the kid. One day you find out, you open the issue, it's like, sorry, I had to go to the school play, I didn't have time to update the library, and the InfoSec team knows that this is what you're doing. And then you put that on autopilot because something DevOps, something automation, and you're literally sucking in these libraries at build time. How am I supposed to protect the enterprise when I know you haven't even looked at the code? So I think there's a bit of empathy required when we're working with each other. And if you find it hard to gather that empathy, you can literally volunteer for a rotation to be on that team, work with that spreadsheet a little while, and ask yourself, can you make the spreadsheet go away? And if you can't do it, then hopefully you gain a little bit more respect about why it still exists, because sometimes these are hard problems. So that personal responsibility with a dash of empathy, that's how you actually move forward. and then you can start practicing that culture that you always wanted.
Awesome. All right. Now, before you landed, we had some Twitter questions. So can we go to grab one or two of the Twitter questions, and I'll read them out. I think you can see them there. A question for Kelsey: if you could turn back time and start from scratch, and you could influence the development of Kubernetes, what would have you done differently? And thank you, Thomas, for the question.
I actually felt like I did a good job in that community. I remember the first time Kubernetes started to get real traction, and someone on Twitter said, Kubernetes is going to kill Mesos. And I responded, that is totally unnecessary, because we've learned so much from Mesos to even get to this point. This community ain't about that. That's not the energy we bring in. We ain't going to war with Mesos. And the person fell back and said, my bad. And I think that example helped define how we should behave in the Kubernetes community. Remember, there's a lot of vendors that compete rigorously with each other, but we find a way to contribute on the same project, and we compete with each other in our business, but not necessarily in the community all the time. So I was really happy about that one. The other thing I think I would have wished I did a little bit more of was telling people the technology is not your identity. There were so many people that just couldn't wait to be a Kubernetes system administrator, and they just can't stop walking around the office, Kubernetes, Kubernetes, Kubernetes. Hey, I broke my arm. Rub some Kubernetes sauce on it. It's like, no, man, go to a doctor. It's not a universal solution for anything. So I think if I were to go back to influence the development, I think one thing we could have did is stop a lot sooner. Kubernetes started adding so many features that maybe we didn't need all of those features. I think ingress was one of them. Ingress looks really cute when you're starting out, but then you need to do features in Nginx, and you have like 10,000 annotations because the ingress object is inefficient to describe how to actually run an Nginx load balancer. So we should have been very clear that these are just the defaults, not necessarily the best practice. And if you find something that doesn't work, that should have been a bigger part of the feedback loop. But I think for the most part, the entire community did operate that way. But looking back, hindsight 2020, we could have did a little bit more of that in some more areas.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. Is there another question? No? I'm trying to read hand signals here. Keep moving. Okay, cool. Well, let's announce the swag. So we've got little giveaways. Now we're trying to be more socially responsible here at Google with swag. So instead of t-shirts and things, we've actually got on the way out, you'll grab these little packs, and it'd be great to do yourselves or with your kids. But inside the pack, there's some cutouts, and you'll be able to create a mini Minecraft version of Kelsey to take home. Your kids are going to love it. Online, are we able to support those that are not here? Ash, yes, yes. So if you're online, post in the chat if you want to, and marketing will do their best to get one out to you if you'd like a.
So when I saw this for the first time, I was like, this looks like a voodoo doll. So I don't want any of you taking arms off, because my arm started hurting yesterday morning. I'm like, I bet someone was like pulling this. So don't do that. Yeah, don't do anything to it. Just leave it as it is. Kelsey wants to be made whole, so leave it as it is.
All right. Cool. Why don't we shift gears a little bit and go to some of the online questions that you've either asked in the room or that have come from people online. So we'll jump to those. They'll come up in a sec, and we can choose which ones we go to first. So Ashley in the room has asked, has anything surprised you this week?
Oh, yes, by no doubt. There's a team that's like entirely Windows-based. I'm allergic to Windows. Like literally, I tried to use it and I broke out and I said never again. And so I have a bias towards what's possible with Windows. Right? I don't spend enough time with it to understand the limitations of it fully. And so when the team was like, yeah, we're primarily Windows, and they jumped on the whiteboard, I was like, this is probably going to be terrible. And I don't know how I'm going to tell them that there is nothing I can do for them. But the dope thing about it was they figured out how to schedule Windows workloads in a way similar to Kubernetes, but they're not using Kubernetes. They figured out a way to compartmentalize and move things from the old version of .NET to the newer versions of .NET Core. Means they now have the option to run on Linux if they so choose, and they've already moved a few apps. And so they're staying on top of the game. And so for me, I think that kind of really represents like that true pragmatic and professional engineer. I know what I have, and I know how to move forward incrementally to get to something better. And they were so well positioned, and they drew that on the whiteboard first. And then he asked me what was my opinion. I said, first of all, this is really, really good. No matter what I tell you going forward, you should know that this is really, really good. And so what we can do now is just brainstorm how some of the things you've built may be built into some of the other systems, especially if you're looking to move to Linux. And so it took me a second to try to like unwind my bias about Windows and how I'm probably still allergic to it. But now I feel like you can do a lot more with Windows, and I'm looking forward to following up with the team to really get a deeper dive into that architecture, because there are some people that literally still need to use Windows, and so now I'll have at least more advice on the Windows front in order to advise them that, hey, maybe stick with that, but try this pattern instead. So I was literally taken aback.
Awesome. Okay, this is a good one. I saw it on Twitter from Derek, and he said, over 70 years of adding new layers of abstraction, yet the speed of which we create solutions appears unchanged. Are the problems just becoming more complex, or do we keep picking the wrong abstractions?
No, I think we keep picking the right abstractions at the right time. We just have a bad sense of time. If you were on mainframes in the 70s, you were cutting edge. You changed the game. If you're on mainframes in 2022, like that might be a slightly different story, but it was the right abstraction at that time. And so we don't really think that these things will change. I remember I went to Germany maybe about 3 years ago, and it was a Kubernetes meetup. It's like 300 people in this room, and they were really proud. I think one guy had a Kubernetes tattoo. He was all in. And I started to talk. Kubernetes is going to die one day, and here's ideas on what will replace it. And they were all like, what the hell? I just got my Kubernetes certification. And I was like, something has to replace it. If nothing comes along and replaces Kubernetes, that means something went wrong. We ran out of ideas. We found no better way to solve problems. No new computer science research. That's the end? I'm not ready for that. And so I think what happens is sometimes we're afraid that if we pick something now, there will be a better thing that comes later. And that's okay too. You literally got to do what you got to do now. I think the thing that we're all getting better with is understanding that it will change. So we're starting to get abstractions that reflect the ability to change. When I saw the container image for the first time, this glorified tarball with layers in it, but the thing it did different was Red Hat Package Manager, Python eggs, Ruby gems. All of them are so platform specific, and they don't work in any other context or domain. And then we get this better abstraction that comes along and says, let's assume that the OS doesn't matter, and we're not going to lean on any one of them. And finally, after what, 30, 40 years, we have a packaging format, and the beautiful part about it, somehow Docker convinced the world in about 5 years we should all standardize on it, regardless of what open source system or OS you're using. I'm not saying everyone's running a container, but I think people realize that if you're going to go to a new container or a packaging format, that's probably the one we're going to choose. So I think now it's really about reflecting on where we've been with these abstractions and make sure that the abstractions are actually portable. The ones that are portable, I think, will allow us to move beyond and support change. So I would say most of our abstractions do not support change. So when we use them, they feel brittle 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And also, we probably got to stop saying the word legacy. A lot of people say this is the legacy thing. In most industries, when you're really good for a long time, they give you like lifetime achievement awards, or they put you in the Hall of Fame. We get mad at our systems that actually generate money to fulfill our paychecks. So I just think we got to put all of these things in context and put time in it, and then realize it's going to change, and how prepared are you to do that?
It's going to be awesome to see the thing that comes after Kubernetes.
It will come. It's probably already here. That's the weird part about it. It's probably already here. It's just going to take people a little bit of time to realize it.
Cool. All right, Jowan, apologies if I said the name wrong, in the room. What depletes your energy, and how do you get your energy back? And I can tell you, I've been watching him do this like non-stop, back to back, one session to the next. And I'm asking the same question. Where does it come from?
I remember I was on call, and I don't know if you've ever been on call before, but for some reason, companies like to take change windows that start at midnight, that go to 6 a.m., and everyone's in the war room, sitting around. So you're already tired from working the full day. You come back into this change window, and you already know it ain't gonna work. Like literally it didn't work in testing. Why are we in this change window? And so you sit there, nothing happens. At 5:48 a.m., we're gonna have to roll this back. Could told you that at like 12. And so now I'm burnt out. We did all of this and achieved absolutely nothing. And most people, if you're like me, I get burned out when I feel like I put all this effort in and nothing happens. You prepare, you spend all this time putting together the design doc, only go to the meeting and no one reads it, and they just say no by default. That burns you out. Even though it's still unhealthy to work too much, but you ever work real hard and it works? 14 hours in, and it finally compiles, you do that little dance. Oh, it works. You call your friend, hey, it works. Like, dude, I'm literally asleep and I don't care. But you got all of this energy. And so if you've ever seen me give a keynote, the thing I've learned to do was, when I got something to work on my computer just at home, I capture that feeling and I put it in the keynote. And my job is to get you to feel the same way, the same suspense. Is this actually going to work? Is he really going to take this container out of Kubernetes and put it into Lambda? I don't believe it. And it works. And you're like, holy. And you feel like I feel, at least for those few minutes. And when I get that feedback loop, I'm ready to do it again. So all those customer meetings, and there's a person, have you ever done a customer meeting or a meeting with your team? There's someone that comes in with their arms crossed. I don't think he knows what he's talking about. And then you work on them. Even though you're talking to everybody, you're working on them. And then they uncross their arms. Then they go get the notepad. They start taking notes. Could you say the last part again? And at the end, they shake your hand. I really enjoyed the session. When are you coming back? And that to me feels like, remember how I respect gaining new skills and perspective? I know that I was a part of this person doing that in real time. So I'm ready to do it again. So that's where my source of energy comes from. And it's usually that feedback loop that tells me I'm making progress.
Good stuff. Nathan has asked on Twitter, are there any particular ways you see organizations using Kubernetes that is, in your opinion, limiting team flow?
Yeah, all the time. So think about what, I was a full-time developer before. I've been on platform teams before. As a developer, I get some requirements from the team. We need a website so people can fill out a form to do something. Okay. You do your thing. You check in the code. What do you expect to happen next? It to be in the hands of your customer, right? I wrote some code. It works on my machine. It worked in dev. How hard can it be? For 40 years, we've been copying binaries to servers and giving them IP addresses and letting people click on things. And so people get Kubernetes and say, all right, forget all of that. Hey, dev, we're going to teach you Kubernetes. But why? I'm going to write some code. I'm going to check it in, and you just have to get it in front of customers. That's it. What does Kubernetes have to do with this? And some people will stop the show and run around teaching their whole team Kubernetes, and then you got like 10,000 YAML files on your laptop, and they're like, this is the new process. The thing is, Kubernetes is assembly language. It's very low level. It has all of these things so you can actually represent complex workloads. You were never meant to give people all that complexity. If you know the workflow for your actual team, let's say 15 years ago, the same person making a website with a form that people click on, and you put it in front of customers. However you were doing that before, let's say you're using Puppet, Chef, or Ansible. You know those configuration management tools. I check in my code. You build some package. You tell that thing to put it on the server, and then it's up. Kubernetes comes out. What does that have to do with my actual workflow? Instead of Puppet, it's Kubernetes. Why are we making such a big deal about Kubernetes? It's a last mile technology. Yes, does it have some benefits that if a node dies, the app will come up on another machine? Great, that should have always been on your roadmap. You could have done that with Puppet and some auto-scaling groups. So I think companies tend to leak too much of these implementation details. And so it causes this disruption. So if you've been a developer, you went through the Vagrant phrase. Remember Vagrant? You got your laptop and there's like 10,000 VMs and it got real hot and everybody started complaining about Mac fans going off. But yeah, you got 50 VMs on your laptop. And then a couple years later, they're like, you gotta check out this Docker thing. All right, I got Docker going. Forget Docker, we're doing Minikube now. He's like, listen, y'all need to make up your mind. We're literally doing the same thing. It's literally the same app. So I think that's the part where we forget that Kubernetes is a last mile technology. It has some abstractions that are really good at doing things for deployments and orchestration, but the front of that stack is roughly the same as it's always been for 15 years. Focus on getting that flow good no matter where the deployment target is, and Kubernetes will never be the centerpiece if you get this part right. It will actually be invisible. So when Kubernetes disappears from the minds of most of the team, that's how you know that you got the right workflow in place.
Stuff. All right, and Duncan, watching live, thank you. With so many new technologies and ideas appearing every week, how do you determine where to focus your attention?
How do I determine where to focus? So I always like the hype. When you see the hype, people going crazy online, like this is literally the future. Like this is the future? I gotta check this out. So I remember when Service Mesh came out. People was like, this is the future. I was like, damn, I'm really interested. So I went over to Lyft, where Mike Klein works. They created Envoy. I was like, I'm here to see the future. He was like, prepare yourself. I said, okay, how does this work? Okay, we got this thing called Envoy. I was like, okay, I'm following. How you spell it? And it takes HTTP traffic, okay? And we give it a config on where to send that HTTP traffic. Okay, what else? It does rate limiting. Like, what else does it do? We actually generate the config with Python and upload it to S3. Can I see the config? This is not readable at all. Yeah, I know, we're working on that. Then Istio comes out. And I was like, does it serve static files? No. People have static files, you know, but this is not really good at it. What should I use? Nginx. Nginx and Istio at the same time? Like, yeah. I was like, this ain't the future. And now it's good. It's an improvement that we can automate a lot of load balancer functionality, but this ain't the future. This is progression. And so then I put it back down and say, I think I understand what's going on here. So what I try to do is really learn the fundamentals. And the fundamentals help me pattern match. Hey, here's a new way of doing serverless. Remember serverless was all the hype? The future is code snippets and messages. I was like, damn, where did I hear this before? Enterprise Service Bus. Let me go look at some old Java code I wrote. On message, do this, parse a bunch of XML, and put it in Oracle. All right, could you show me one of these serverless functions? Parse a bunch of JSON and put it in DynamoDB. This looks the same. That's what we're doing before. So I put it back. So I'm the type of person that just wants to understand what all the hype is about. I'm willing to go super deep, and usually I walk away with, that literally is not the future. And it's okay. So I don't think things actually change as much as people think they do. There's new people entering our space all the time, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of respect for history in the tech world, right? If something doesn't work, what do? Import library that literally 2 million other people use, and you say, oh, it doesn't have this one feature. I'm going to write my own. Because we don't really think about the cost that it comes with that. So that's how I do it. I make sure I pay attention, because I like to respect things that come out. I dive as deep as I can. I seek understanding. And I have this concept of learning in public. You may have seen some of my learning in public experiments on Twitter. And that's just how I go about it.
And I've noticed you tend to play with things. You jump in, you use the tech. It was interesting, Kelsey asked a customer this week, how do you learn? And there was a lot of blank stares in the room.
You know what, that was the most surprising thing. If the company is paying you to help them utilize technology to run the business, and you are unaware what's available. Let's say you ask someone to build a house, and they are unaware that there's things like heated floors. They're unaware of this thing called a kitchen. He's like, no, there's refrigerators and stoves and sinks. Like, oh no, man, we don't need that. I've been building houses since 1903. It's like, yeah, but it's 2022. And I can't believe you're unaware of some of these modern advances like air conditioning. Like, we got windows. And so I think when I hear that I think people forget that you're actually responsible for being in the know. Even if you don't plan to use it, you should still be in the know and be able to say why you're not using it.
Yeah. All right, linking to that topic, Bashal on Twitter, welcome to Australia, Kelsey. I'd be curious to know what web dev trends are you finding most exciting about in 2022?
Oh, this sounds like a trap. I'll touch on it a little bit. When I saw Web 3, like the number 3, I was really interested. I was like, because like when I was working at Puppet Labs, I implemented a package manager in Puppet, and it's really hard to deal with the diamond dependency problem and resolving circular dependencies. And so semantic versioning was a big deal because that usually indicates when you should use a major version of a package. And typically, we don't increment the major version number unless there's something so big and important that we do that. So Web 3. I didn't realize that I was doing Web 2. So I was super interested about Web 3 because of the name and the major version bump. And so when you look at the ideas behind it, and I actually like some of them, things like IPFS, this idea that, think about how we've been using files, right? You ever go to a web page and you click on a link and it's gone because someone took down the FTP server finally? Well, that's unnecessary. We have better ways of doing that. We can actually use hashes of files and do a better job of distributing those things. That's how we do it in Docker. Why not treat that the same way for files? So I think that people are rethinking some of these things, thinking about how do we decentralize and distribute some of our computing systems. That's super interesting to me. But even when I look deeper, there's still HTTP, there's still web browsers, you're still putting data somewhere, and you're still moving things around. And at the end of the day, no matter what happens in web, you're still focused on the customer and the experiences so they can get a job done. So whether it's Web 2, Web 3, React Native or not, at the end of the day, you're just trying to create an experience for your customers. So I think we've got to make sure that even though web evolves, you're kind of beholden to have an experience that's familiar because they won't know how to use it if you're too far off in the future.
All right. We're going to come back to more of these questions in a moment. We'll just shift gears and give you a chance to grab a glass of water. But there's an interesting video we found online, which is an excerpt from a documentary. Can we play the video and then we'll come back and talk about it?
So what does it take to be a successful tech evangelist? I actually hate the word evangelist. Typically when I think about evangelism is someone believes something so deeply and sometimes even blind by it. And they talk almost religiously about that technology in order to convert people to a similar set of beliefs. And honestly, it's very effective to anything, marketing, advertising, and to open source projects that people may want to use. I like the term advocacy a little bit better. It flips it around. As an advocate, you're trying to make sure that the technology works for the person on the other side of the keyboard, the user or the community. And so when that product or technology falls short, as an advocate, you try to fill in the gap between those two things. So you'll commonly hear me talk about Kubernetes in terms of its gaps or its shortcomings or where it shouldn't be used. Sometimes I'll say you haven't mastered a technology until you know when it shouldn't be used. And I think advocates owe themselves the responsibility to know when it's the right tool. And when I think about evangelism, to be successful, you need to really believe in the thing you're telling people about. because depending on the passion you bring to the conversation, they may or may not believe you, and that's a big component of evangelism. But I think for advocacy, you can borrow some of those things. And I do think I work really hard to make sure that I'm convinced first. And the way I do it is by building real things on top of Kubernetes with my own hands. And then when I go out to the world and say, here's why I solved a very specific problem using this particular tool. And then it feels less about evangelism, and it feels more like advocacy. So I think you just got to bring a bit of authenticity to it, and I think that's what separates those two.
So the background to this video is it's part of an online series, which is a Kubernetes documentary, which you can access on YouTube. Can you talk a bit about like how that documentary came about, what was behind it, and why a documentary on Kubernetes?
Yeah, there's a team who does a lot of these technology documentaries. They're phenomenal, by the way. Excellent storytellers. I mean, they try to explore the history of these technologies while we're like still here, which is amazing, so they can get the full context. But that documentary, I think it kind of started out predicated on the container wars. I mean, Docker versus Mesos, Docker versus Red Hat, Docker versus Google. There was a lot of hype at that time about who would emerge as the orchestration winner. Every cloud provider had their own orchestration tool. Fargate, Mesos at Microsoft. And then even Google didn't have necessarily a container orchestration platform at the time. And the whole world thought everyone would just adopt Docker or something like Docker Swarm, and then that would be it. And then right at that particular time period, there was like 4 or 5 of them, Nomad from HashiCorp, and everyone was sitting here was like, there's no way the industry can support all of these things, essentially doing the same thing. And so they wanted to build a documentary about a little bit of the drama and what was going on behind the scenes. And I remember talking to the producers of the show, and I think I, in the documentary, explained to people that there really wasn't a war because a lot of us were going to each other's offices through that whole time period, talking to each other, building things, committing to each other's repositories. Even though we did, debate each other on Twitter, there was a pull request right afterwards. And so a lot of the things that we were doing is that we just saw this opportunity. At Google, we have this phrase we say sometimes, respect the opportunity. And we saw this opportunity to move the whole industry forward, and we were all putting our ideas forward, and actually the industry was ready for it at the time. And so they just interviewed everyone from the Docker team, to the Google team, to the Red Hat team, the core contributors, the people that were building the community, to try to get the whole story. And the way it ended out was, it was a community effort, and the marvelous part was all the competitors decided to agree on something and ship it, and we all moved in lockstep. And I reminded people that Docker is still there. etcd is still there. None of these things actually went away. Most of them are actually still part of the stack. It's just that we keep moving up and up the stack. And eventually, there will be something that will come around and replace Kubernetes. And my guarantee is it's going to be people from the Kubernetes community leading the charge. And so we kind of left it on this high note that before Kubernetes existed, people saw some shortcoming, came together, and built this thing. And the same thing is going to happen again, and that is the actual power of open source. But they had this beautiful documentary that just takes you through that 6-year history of all the challenges and the actual people involved. So it was really wonderful seeing all these people I was working with over the years essentially have a retrospective in video format. So go check it out if you're really interested in that history of how this thing Kubernetes came to be.
Cool. And Michael in the room has asked a relevant question about the early days of that and dealing with those teething issues and first things to focus on. How did you figure out what problems to solve first? And did you have a project or something that you were working on to test against around that?
Yeah, so I would give a big shout out to like the Google team that was working on things like Borg, right? They were very humble. Remember, Google was putting out all of these white papers, the Borg paper, an intern that went on to go found Mesosphere, Ben Hyman and team that was at Twitter. They did the Mesos paper. There were all these ideas about what's the best way to do the scheduling thing, and then what the API should actually look like. So you got like 20 years of practice at Google alone, and you combine it with the rest of the industry that have been running these things in production, and they come together and they produce this Kubernetes thing, and big credit to Docker, who was the base layer. they had really figured out this concept of sharing a container image, something that no one else in the industry really figured out. We kind of left it to the runtimes to get that thing going. But one thing that we really did that was was Google was humble enough to understand, number one, they put out a container runtime. Anyone know what that container runtime was called? Exactly, and that was the response when it was released on GitHub. It was written in C++, it was called Let Me Contain That For You. And everybody was like, cool story, bro. Docker it is. And so they realized that they had to be compatible, and innovation comes from everywhere. So the Google team had to take their experience and merge it with the rest of the world. And so one thing we did was, number one, we had to support everything that Docker was doing, even though we didn't agree 100% with the API. And the feedback loop was amazing. Previously, Cloud Foundry and Heroku had threw in the towel on trying to run things like stateful workloads or even enterprise applications written in some heavyweight things and needing things like local file systems and volumes. And they said the whole world would just be stateless and you would just isolate all the hard parts somewhere else. But Kubernetes is like, nah, that's not true. We need to support batch jobs. We need to be able to support some stateful services. And we're going to get there over time, and here's how it will work. And so when anyone will report an issue, I'm trying to run Atlassian's Jira in Kubernetes, but I can't figure out how to do it. I need a volume. I need an XML config file. I need this, that, and the other. And we looked at it and it's like, all right, config maps are a thing. Volumes are a thing. Can you try that again? So we had this idea that you shouldn't have to change the application in order to use it in Kubernetes. And that was a big departure of the systems that came before. 12-factor apps, modern, Spring Boot. It's like, stop playing. These are just apps making system calls using standard interfaces that have been around for a very long time. You just need to teach your orchestration tools how to leverage them. And so that kept the whole platform super honest. So each feature that came was there to support an existing workload. The last thing I'll say here is I remember the big data community came in. And there was all these ideas about getting Spark to work on Kubernetes and where to do the work. And that was the first time I saw the Mesos team get involved. They had a dedicated team contributing to Kubernetes, taking the learnings from Mesos and adding them to Kubernetes because there was no reason why Hadoop and Spark shouldn't work well on Kubernetes. And we continued to mature the platform. And the same was from OpenShift. Kubernetes should also work for the PaaS use case. And so they brought in things like deployments and in-place updates, this concept of volumes and volume types and mounts. So I think we really had a respectful feedback loop, and we said pretty much every workload should work in Kubernetes, and we will keep adding pragmatic features until it does.
Yep. Cool. This next question from Vaughan, watching live. I've seen a few customers ask this question, so it's probably on a lot of people's minds, and it's asking about some Google Cloud technology. What in your opinion, are a few pros and cons of GKE, so Kubernetes on Google Cloud, versus Cloud Run for enterprise workloads? And what's next for Cloud Run?
So one thing I think that if you zoom all the way back and you think about what Kubernetes is, it's the thin layers on top of VMs and infrastructure. That's what it is. It took things like auto-scaling groups, load balancers, VPCs, all of that stuff, and put an API on top. And given the fact that we now have APIs for most infrastructure, this is why Kubernetes runs really well in the cloud, where you have an API for storage volumes. You have a key management service to encrypt secrets at rest. When you bring all of that stuff underneath and you put Kubernetes on top, that's what GKE is. It integrates the best of GCE, load balancers included, behind this common API, and we can do all kind of amazing things with it. The drawback is you can do all kind of amazing things with it. You got people with Prometheus, Fluentd, Open Policy Agent, Gatekeeper. I'm like, dude, do you have any apps in this cluster? Because people just kept kind of building a cloud platform in a box. People forgot that you can actually use cloud services alongside Kubernetes. You can actually use a fully managed database that doesn't run in the cluster. And so people start to pack more and more in. Now, if you've been doing Kubernetes for a while, you get tired of YAML files, right? You're like, this Helm thing is not for me. I'm ready to move on. After using Kubernetes for a while, you recognize a few patterns. You have a container, you get some traffic, and you put stuff in a database. Do we really need all of this for that? And so Knative was born, and this is the App Engine team. Maybe getting a little jealous. Nobody's talking about App Engine. Everyone's talking about this Kubernetes team. And the App Engine team is like, what if we were to run App Engine on Kube, right? Because at that time, Kubernetes is not developer friendly, it's too hard to use, and it's too complex. And so they layered this API on top, and we gave it a bad name on purpose, Knative. Because that's not the product, that's the project, and Cloud Run is the product. And so what does the product do? Well, things that are missing in Kubernetes, like traffic management, right? You got 3 pods running, and you want to send 50% of traffic to the new version. How do you do it in current Kubernetes? You get 3 and 3, 6, 50%. Cool. Pretty bad design, but that's all you can do. There's no concept of traffic management unless you add something like Istio. And then you had a bunch of tools doing things like 3 of these, 3 of these, 2 of these, 4 of these. And it was just very clunky. So there's none of that built into Kubernetes by default. So Cloud Run took a lot of the things that were working in App Engine, traffic management, DNS, SSL, and also decoupled it from projects. So now you can have multiple region Cloud Run instances in one project, game changer for a lot of people. And then we started to decouple things like memory store, Redis, from App Engine. We decoupled a lot of things that were App Engine only and surrounded them around Cloud Run. And we held one big thesis around Cloud Run was, you can learn a lot from Kubernetes API designs. You know, jobs in Kubernetes, we essentially ported that to Cloud Run. So now you can take very similar job spec and let Cloud Run run it. We added secrets to Cloud Run. So you can now mount secrets into a Cloud Run instance just like you could in Kubernetes, supporting more workloads. And then there was a pivotal point. We were chasing the serverless movement, cold starts, scale to 0, event-driven. But we're talking about containers. I can actually put existing apps Haskell if I want to. Why are you limiting me to some scale to 0 when I can actually benefit from concurrency? I can benefit from a lot more traffic than one function per invocation. So we decided to just take the limitations off of Cloud Run and let it be a competitive container platform. And so now there's a lot of companies. Recently, we just announced 8 CPUs, 32 gigs of RAM for a serverless platform because people are now running ML workloads on it. We added NFS support to Cloud Run. And there's this one workload that I use, Vault from HashiCorp. I said, when I can run a Vault in Cloud Run and not Kubernetes, that's when Cloud Run is ready. I believe Cloud Run should be able to do what GCE can do without the maintenance overhead. And so Cloud Run has started to evolve. So we're starting to blur the lines. And there's another platform in the middle, GKE Autopilot. When we were designing that, we said, what will happen if you got rid of the nodes? How would Kubernetes work? And it works a lot like Cloud Run. So the big difference is Kubernetes supports custom workload abstractions, CRDs. You can define a new workload type and how it works. And Kubernetes teaches us a lot of things. But when we find patterns, we tend to take the best patterns, jobs, and deployments. Those are in Cloud Run. And once Cloud Run closes the gap on native VPC, we now have always-on CPU. We support WebSockets, gRPC. But until we get native VPC, meaning when you run that Cloud Run instance, you get an IP that's compatible with your on-prem data connection thing, is compatible with your VPC service controls. It can mount a TPU to do machine learning. That gap gets closed. We do want people to feel like there's a continuum. I can start in GKE and put it in Cloud Run. I have a prototype that I'm working on where you run a job in GKE, and if you set the scheduler thing to Cloud Run equals true, I'll run it in Cloud Run and then just pipe the metrics and logs back to GKE, and you can't tell the difference. When we get to that point, I think we've completed the continuum.
And Bilal has asked a follow-up question. Do you think the serverless paradigm will eventually replace the containerized workloads in the near future? Yeah, sorry, it's hot. I know it's hot up here.
I'm frying. Maybe
It's
a
some
hoodie
good
is not the best thing to do.
So do you think serverless will be kind of the, or should, if you can start there, should you start there? Is maybe another way to.
Once we stop saying serverless, that's how you know we've made it.
Okay.
Because I think serverless was like, I don't know, there was a real war around it. I came in the serverless community like, why is it only functions? there's a lot of apps that can benefit from this model. I like the model, but event-driven architectures, that's not the best for everything. And lo and behold, Amazon gave us a gift. They went to reInvent and said, serverless database. And that whole community lost it because they broke the fourth wall. It is not just functions. And I was like, Amazon said other things can be serverless, and that includes containers. And like, Kelsey, serverless is not containers, you don't understand. Then they gave me another gift at reInvent. They added serverless containers to Lambda. And I remember taking that and running a Lambda function, because there's now a shim that you can enable, and I ran that Lambda function in Cloud Run, and it worked. And so we're now starting to blur the line. So I think the new definition of serverless will be fully managed for real. And if you're thinking about it, Gmail is serverless. Salesforce is serverless. Cloudflare is serverless. And so are all those CDNs that are out there. It's just now that we got to start raising the bar. Let's Encrypt is serverless. So once we start applying this logic across the board, I think most people just want to make Linux system calls. They don't want to manage a Linux server. Those are two different things. So I'm really glad that Cloud Run is trending towards, we're going to give you in a very safe and fully managed way to make Linux system calls without thinking about all the low-level details. So I do think at some point, serverless containers is a packaging format that's compatible with lots of runtimes. And I think it will actually win out, because if you ever looked at all the serverless platforms that are out there, they all have different function signatures. And so now I think about functions as frameworks. Node.js Express is a framework. JBoss is a framework. Lambda is a framework. So we took that to the logical conclusion in GCP. Cloud Functions v2 doubles down on that philosophy. So when you do gcloud deploy your function, what we do behind the scenes is we take your app, and I worked on Go support for Cloud Functions, and we wrap it in a worker code that is the actual frameworks, and we put it in a container, we put it in a registry, and we run it on Cloud Run. So if you're using Cloud Functions v2, you are literally using Cloud Run. So I think we have proof that it went the other way. Containers will probably be the future, because it's already the present, even on Lambda. So I think people got confused between Docker, the runtime, and containers, the packaging format. Because the only thing we want is a clean contract. Here's my app. Here's how it works as an entirety. Can you run it for me? And that's the North Star.
Awesome. All right. Now, Mike's asked a very relevant question for this market. We've got a lot of organizations here that know how to run VMs in data centers really well. And cloud's now coming at them, Kubernetes. How do these teams overcome the steep learning curve to kind of really learn how to, not just what Kubernetes is, but how do you operationalize it? How do you use it as a production platform for an organization that has been entrenched in VMs for many years?
I'm trying to think of a bad analogy. Sometimes people don't realize that they already know 90% of something. Think about this. I remember going to my first trip out of the US, I went to South Korea. Not everyone speaks English there. Then my second trip was to Japan. Not everyone speaks English there. So I had in my head that everyone speaks a different language. So I went to England thinking I would have like this language problem. And I realized that they speak English. They speak a different dialect to some degree. Queen's English and some other thing they told me about. And so when I talk to people about VMs, I said, let me see what you do. Most people that are using VMware on-prem, they typically have one app per VM. Lots of people are doing that pattern. And on that VM, if you're really good at how you build your VMs, like with Packer or some other automation tools, the only thing in that VM is what the app needs and nothing more. And then I say, well, are you using things like link clones, where you take an image of the VM, and so when you need another one, you just kind of do this smooth file system copy thing, and it's up super quick? They're like, yeah. I was like, do you use file systems? Like, uh-huh. Does each VM get an IP? They're like, yeah. And I said, okay, what if I told you that Packer can spit out Docker images? using the same config you used to create the VMware image. Like Kelsey literally won't work. I said, let's just try it. And then you say output format Docker. Now you end up with something a bit bloated with systemd, starting things, but whatever. It's still this file system layout that you give instead of to a hypervisor, you give to a container runtime, and then the app starts. We don't think about entry points in operating systems, but there is one, and it starts the kernel, and the kernel kicks off init, and init starts the processes that you have configs for. Docker just skips all of that because it's only meant to run one process. So you explain it to people that way, and they're like, so I'm already using containers? I was like, shh. Since Red Hat 5, the Linux kernel has been running containers, maybe not in the way Docker does it, but you're just running in the default namespace. You're running in the default mount space. So can I update LinkedIn that I know containers? It's like, yeah, 10 years of experience too. Wow, I didn't know I've been using containers. So I'm doing things cloud native. I wouldn't go that far, but you definitely have some container experience. And then it becomes less scary. Instead of using the default namespace, I'll be explicit and get my own. So instead of running the nice command to isolate things, I'll just get my own namespace. And then I'll use things like C groups to throttle CPU between them. And so you just got to do this mental mapping. And so I blame us. We didn't do a good job teaching people that this wasn't actually evolutionary. It was a better workflow on an existing set of technologies to make it finally usable. And then the light bulb goes off. And then they have a lot of confidence. So now when they look at Docker, they start comparing notes to the way they do things already. And so they have the confidence, and sometimes confidence is required when you're learning something.
Awesome. All right, we'll ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. Xmozero, awesome name online. Can AI replace DevOps? What are your thoughts?
Wow. I know very little about AI, but I do pay attention to how it works. And I'll be brave and I'll ask people that are like senior engineers at Google AI questions. And I say, okay, if I have a grocery store and I sell cereal, and human intuition is really good. Let's say you stock the cereal boxes. This is no AI, just humans. You go and you stock the cereal. I notice that the cereal with the most sugar is always out of stock. Always. And one day I put it on a different shelf to see if people even care about shelf placement. And I watch people and they still go find the cereal with the most sugar in it. And maybe there's a specific brand of cereal that people like to buy. As a human, I can predict that people are going to buy the cereal with the sugar on it. So when people walk in the store, I bet she's going to buy that cereal with the sugar in it. How you know? Look at the kids. They're going to be buying the sugar cereal. And so we can do that quite easily. Humans are really good at pattern recognition. Even things we've never done before, we're really good. We also have this thing like our gut feeling. Based on prior experiences, we can link them and do them in real time. Most people have never done that analysis on themselves, so they don't realize how powerful the human mind actually is. So when you say, can AI replace a DevOps engineer? There's a lot that goes on. Have you been in like a war room where the system has crashed? Where's the logs? We don't have any. AI is typically predicated on data to make a decision. AI is predicated on having lots of data to train the model to make a decision. And typically when AI gets the wrong data, it sometimes still makes a decision, but it may not be the right one. The other part is AI has no responsibility. There was one company that tried to apply AI to filter resumes from candidates. Depending on who trains the model is how it's probably going to behave, right? Who are the best employees at the company? You have an opinion. You train the model that these are the most successful employees. Here's their resumes. So naively, you take that as your data set. These are resumes that obviously have confirmation bias. Good employees have resumes that look like this. So you start rejecting other resumes. You look around, and all the people you hire look the same. They went to the same schools, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, damn, we got the same results when the humans were doing it. Turns out that the bias crept into the model because the machine has no intuition to say, hey, these are pretty terrible decisions. So DevOps is a very complex thing. To believe that we can take the entire complexity of DevOps, that someone understands it well enough, that they can build the perfect model, and then have enough data from all around the world to train the model on what good DevOps looks like. I don't think we're there. So to me, I think what we can do is automate things. And the reason why I used that earlier example about the grocery store, most people just need analytics. If you're doing DevOps, get some logs, get some metrics. You don't need AI to tell you the app is down. It's down. Just do some monitoring. I don't need to predict it's down. It's literally down. And then maybe you get so advanced that you try to predict that it's going to go down because this disk has been spinning on average. But I think analytics can get you pretty close. On average, the disks go out at this time. So just be proactive. If they go down in 80 days, maybe we have a habit of doing it in 60 days. How close do you need to get to 80 days for this to be a good endeavor? So I think what we got to do is say, humans are really good at what we do. Automation can get us pretty far. Analytics can give us even further. If you haven't done those things yet, you think AI may work for you because I don't think you actually understand the limitations of what AI can actually do. And this is why we always laugh when we see the robot and all you do is move the table and it just can't figure anything out anymore. So I would probably say I think AI is a good replacement for brute force algorithms. We found a new way of programming and generating code. Kind of what we're doing, right? We're just kind of generating code based on data instead of a bunch of for loops. So I think if we just be more pragmatic about what AI really is, and then you ask the question, and you would say, no, human intelligence is incredible. We also have this other thing called creativity, right? And so if you put those things in perspective, then we will regulate AI to its proper place. It will be an assistant tool, and we'll oversee it, and we'll try our best to serialize our ability to make predictions and then use it in the right place.
Awesome. We'll leave it there. Thank you, Kelsey. Look, thank you to our audience. It's a mixture of customers and the Google developer community. We hope you've enjoyed this event, and we really appreciate your time this evening. I learn something every time I hear you speak, so it's been.
And appreciate you guys have been doing anything else, and you chose to spend it with us, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you, Kelsey. A reminder for those in the room, grab your mini Kelsey on the way out. There's packs over there. Online, if you fill out the survey, you can get someone in touch there to get it if you'd like a mini Kelsey to take home.
And not remove any body parts from the thing.
He's a little worried about this.
I am.
Thank you, everyone. Wish you a good evening.